gate that opens only in starlight. In the high desert of what we now call Jordan, where the air tastes of copper and ancient dust, there stands a temple that was never meant for daylight. It rises from the sandstone cliffs like a prayer carved in stone, silent, immense, impossibly beautiful. The Nabateans built it more than 2,000 years ago, long before the Romans marched their legions across these golden hills, long before the world had names for all its forgotten places. They called it Al-Dair, the monastery, though no monks ever walked its halls, no hymns ever echoed from its chambers, no incense ever burned at its threshold. It waits there still, perched high above the rose-red city of Petra, accessible only by a narrow path of 800 steps. 800 thresholds between the world below and whatever lies above, each step worn smooth by the feet of pilgrims who climbed in darkness, their sandals whispering against stone, their breath forming small clouds in the cold desert night. They came when the stars turned in their ancient patterns, when certain constellations aligned with the temple's entrance, a doorway 40 meters high, framed by columns that seemed less like architecture and more like the fingers of gods, holding up the ceiling of heaven itself. The journey to Al-Dair is not a gentle one. The path winds upward through narrow passages where the rock presses close on either side, where the air grows thin and the silence grows thick. There are no railings, no markers, nothing to guide you but the memory of those who climbed before. In the old times, pilgrims would begin their ascent at dusk, timing their arrival for the moment when the first stars appeared above the temple's facade. They believed, or perhaps they knew, that the gate opened only in starlight, that its true purpose could only be witnessed when the sun had withdrawn and the celestial fires took its place. What drove them to climb? What question burned so fiercely in their hearts that they would risk the path in darkness, would ascend 800 steps toward a structure that held no treasure, no relic, no promised salvation? We do not know. The Nabateans left us the temple, but not the answer. They carved the stone with such precision that even now, after millennia of wind and rain and the slow erosion of time, the columns stand perfectly straight. The doorway frames the sky with geometric grace. But they left no inscription, no text, no explanation carved into the walls. Only the structure itself remains, and the silence it keeps like a covenant. When you pass through that towering doorway, you enter a chamber that defies expectation. It is empty, completely, profoundly empty. No altar where offerings might be laid. No statues of forgotten gods. No tombs sealed with ritual care. Just a hollow space, a room carved from the living rock, its walls smooth and unmarked. And yet, the chamber is not truly empty. At night, when the moon rises and its light falls through the entrance, something happens. The chamber catches that silver glow and holds it, cradles it, as if the stone itself has learned to breathe light. The walls seem to shimmer. The air becomes luminous. And for a moment, just a moment, the emptiness feels like presence, like the space where something sacred once stood, or perhaps still stands, visible only to those who know how to see. Historians have studied Al-Dair for more than a century, measuring its dimensions, analyzing its construction, debating its purpose with the careful language of scholarship. Was it a tomb? Some say yes, pointing to similar structures in Petra that served as burial chambers for Nabatean royalty. Was it a treasury, a place where wealth was stored against invasion or drought? Others argue this, though no trace of riches has ever been found. Was it a temple, a place of worship where the Nabateans came to honor gods, whose names we have forgotten? Perhaps. But none of these explanations quite fits. None of them accounts for the 800 steps, for the alignment with the stars, for the peculiar emptiness of the inner chamber, for the way the stone seems to glow when darkness falls. The Nabateans themselves left no answer. They were a people of the desert, traders who controlled the incense routes, who built their civilization on the flow of frankincense and myrrh from Arabia to the Mediterranean world. They were practical people, skilled engineers, masters of water conservation in an arid land. And yet, they carved Al-Dair. They spent years, perhaps decades, chiseling this monumental structure from solid rock, creating something that served no obvious economic purpose, no practical function. They built it as if they were answering a command from something beyond utility, beyond reason. The stone itself is rose-colored, pale as the first light of dawn. But it is not static. It shifts with the changing day, as if the rock is alive, as if it remembers the sun and the moon and the turning of the seasons. At sunrise, when the first rays touch the temple's facade, it glows amber and gold, warm as honey, radiant as hope. At midday, under the harsh desert sun, it bleaches almost white, stark and overwhelming. At dusk, as the light drains from the sky, the stone turns to ash, to smoke, to shadow. And at night, when the stars emerge and the desert wind goes still, the temple becomes something else entirely. It becomes translucent, almost ephemeral, as if it might dissolve into darkness, as if it were never fully solid, never fully of this world. Those who visit Al-Dair today speak of a peculiar feeling that settles over them as they stand before it. Not fear exactly, not reverence in the ordinary sense, but something subtler, something harder to name. A sense that the temple is waiting, that it was carved not for Nabateans who built it, not for the pilgrims who climbed to it in ancient nights, but for those who would come after, for seekers, for wanderers, for anyone who arrives bearing a question they cannot quite articulate, as if the temple is a vessel, empty on purpose, ready to be filled with whatever longing the visitor brings. The Nabateans themselves vanished from history, absorbed into the Roman Empire, their language forgotten, their trade routes taken over by others, their gods replaced by new deities with new names. But Al-Dair remains. Year after year, century after century, the temple stands on its cliff, opening its gate to starlight, catching the moon in its empty chamber, waiting for the question it was built to answer. Perhaps it was never meant to give answers at all. Perhaps it was meant only to ask, to stand against the sky and demand of us, what are you seeking? What brought you here? To this high place, to this emptiness that somehow feels full. What star are you following? The desert wind moves through the temple's columns, singing in frequencies too low for human ears to fully hear. The stone changes color with the light. The steps wait, worn smooth by pilgrims who climb them in darkness, guided only by starlight and the pull of something they could not name. And the gate remains open, as it has always been, as it perhaps always will be, not closed, not guarded, but simply there, a threshold between earth and sky, between question and silence, between the world we know and the mystery we are still learning to see. Some voices only echo when we are ready to listen. The library that burned before it could be read. There was a place in Alexandria where the world kept its memory, not the memory of kings or battles, not the catalog of conquest and empire, but something deeper, the collected whispers of every civilization that had ever traced symbols onto clay, onto papyrus, onto strips of bark and sheets of hammered metal. The Library of Alexandria. Even the name arrives to us across the centuries like smoke, like the ghost of something that once burned so brightly it illuminated the entire ancient world. In the 3rd century, when Rome was still young and the Mediterranean belonged to no single power, scholars would travel for months to reach this place. They came from Athens and Carthage, from Damascus and distant Persia, from lands beyond the edges of maps, carrying questions they hoped the library could answer. They walked through halls lined with scrolls. Hundreds of thousands of them. Some say 700,000. Others claim more. Each one a voice speaking from the past. Each one a fragment of human thought preserved against the erosion of time. The scrolls were kept in chambers organized by subject and language, tended by librarians who were themselves scholars, men who had devoted their lives to the preservation of knowledge. At night, when the Mediterranean wind moved through the columned halls, these librarians would copy manuscripts by candlelight, their fingers tracing words in Greek and Egyptian, in Aramaic and Sanskrit, in languages already dying, already slipping away into the silence from which all forgotten things eventually come. But the library's greatest treasure was not the scrolls themselves. It was a catalog, the index, the master list of everything contained within those walls. Imagine it. A document that named every text in the collection, every author, every subject. A map of human knowledge as it existed 2,000 years ago. And this catalog, according to those who saw it, listed works that contradicted the official histories, that named gods the Greeks had never heard of, that described stars for which they had no words. It referenced treatises on mathematics that would not be rediscovered until the Renaissance. It mentioned accounts of distant lands, China, perhaps, or the Americas that the Mediterranean world was not supposed to know existed. The catalog was itself a kind of temple, a sacred architecture of knowing. To read it was to understand how much the ancients knew, how much further they had traveled in thought than we sometimes imagine. It was proof that human wisdom does not move in a straight line, does not progress smoothly from darkness into light, but rises and falls, blooms and withers, like everything else that lives. Then came the fires. Not one fire, but many, spread across centuries. Some accidental. A lamp overturned. Oil spilling across dry papyrus. Flames spreading faster than water could be carried to quench them. Some intentional. The library caught in the crossfire war. Scrolls burned by soldiers who could not read them, who saw only kindling for their campfires. Some inevitable. The slow entropy of empire, the gradual neglect of a world turning away from the values that had built the library in the first place. Each time, something irreplaceable turned to ash. Each time, the library diminished, its collection growing smaller, its halls emptier, until finally there was nothing left but ruins and the memory of what had been. What we lost, we can only imagine. There were plays by Sophocles we will never hear, tragedies that might have rivaled Oedipus and Antigone, words that would have made us weep or rage or understand ourselves differently. There were histories of Africa written by Africans, accounts of kingdoms and migrations and philosophies that never made it into the European record, voices silenced not by conquest alone, but by fire, by ash, by the terrible fragility of paper. There were mathematical proofs that might have accelerated science by 1,000 years. Astronomers in ancient Alexandria had already calculated the circumference of the Earth, had built mechanical computers to predict the movements of planets. What else did they know? What equations were lost? What understanding of the cosmos burned before it could be passed on? But more haunting than what we know we lost is what we don't know we lost. The ideas so foreign to our current understanding that we cannot even guess at them. The philosophies that might have changed how we think about consciousness, about time, about the nature of reality itself. The technologies we cannot imagine because the very concepts behind them vanished in the flames. The library's destruction feels less like a historical event and more like a wound in human memory, a gap where knowledge should be, a blank space in the story we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. When the Library of Alexandria burned, it was not just scrolls that were lost. It was possibility. It was the alternative paths human thought might have taken, the questions we might have asked, the answers we might have found. Some say copies survived, that in the hours before the final fire, librarians smuggled scrolls out of the building, hiding them in private collections, in the libraries of wealthy patrons, in monasteries deep in the Egyptian desert. There are stories of caves sealed by sand, their entrances lost to time, where scrolls still wait in the darkness, their words intact, their knowledge preserved, waiting for someone to find them again. Archaeologists search for these caches. They dig in the ruins of ancient estates, in the foundations of forgotten temples. Sometimes they find fragments, a few lines of poetry, a mathematical diagram, a list of names in a language no one speaks anymore. These fragments are precious beyond measure, but they are only fragments. The vast majority of what the library contained is gone. And yet, there is another possibility, one more elusive, more mysterious. Some believe that the most sacred texts were never written down at all, that the deepest knowledge, the truths about the nature of existence, the secrets of the soul's journey, the real names of the divine, these were considered too precious, too dangerous, to commit to paper. They were preserved instead in the oldest way, whispered from teacher to student, in the hour before dawn, when the mind is most open to what cannot be proven, when the veil between knowing and unknowing grows thin. This knowledge, if it existed, would have been oral, transmitted through chains of initiates who memorized not just words but rhythms, intonations, the precise way syllables should be shaped by the mouth. It would have been a living tradition, kept alive in the bodies and voices of those who carried it, independent of libraries, immune to fire. Did such a tradition exist? Does it still? There are mystery schools that claim unbroken lineages stretching back to ancient Egypt, to Babylon, to civilizations whose names have been forgotten. They say they preserve teachings that were old when Alexandria was young, wisdom that predates writing itself. Perhaps they do. Perhaps the library's greatest treasures were never in the library at all, but walking the streets of Alexandria, breathing the same air as the scrolls, carrying in their minds what the scrolls could only approximate. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps the library's purpose was never to preserve knowledge forever, but to gather it for a time, to create a space where ideas from different lands could meet and mingle, where a scholar from India could read the philosophies of Greece, where an Egyptian priest could study Persian astronomy. Perhaps the library was meant to be a crossroads, a temporary confluence of wisdom, and its burning, tragic as it was always part of the pattern. The way a river must eventually reach the sea and dissolve into something larger than itself. The scrolls are gone. The catalog is gone. The building is gone. Even the exact location of the library is disputed, lost beneath the modern city of Alexandria, beneath centuries of construction and destruction and rebuilding. But the hunger that created it remains. The desire to know, to preserve, to pass on what we have learned to those who come after. We build our own libraries now, digital and vast, trying to hold all human knowledge in servers and clouds, in archives that we hope will outlast us. And perhaps they will. Or perhaps, centuries from now, someone will speak of them the way we speak of Alexandria, as a lost wonder, a place where the world's memory was kept before it burned, before it faded, before it became one more ghost haunting the edges of history. In the end, perhaps it was never meant to last. Perhaps some knowledge is meant to be found and lost and found again, each discovery a small resurrection, each loss a reminder that nothing, not even truth, is permanent. The Library of Alexandria burned before most of it could be read, and in that burning, it became immortal. Hashtag the city that drowned in silence. 40 feet beneath the surface of the Mediterranean, where sunlight arrives in pale green columns and the water holds a stillness that feels older than memory, there lies a city that forgot how to die. The Greeks called it Heracleon, after the hero who became a god. The Egyptians knew it as Thonis, naming it for something deeper, something closer to the earth. For more than 1,000 years, it was the gateway to Egypt, the first glimpse of African soil that sailors would see after weeks at sea, the last sight of home for those departing into the unknown. Ships from Athens and Carthage would anchor in its harbor, their hulls heavy with olive oil and wine, with copper and tin, with the countless small treasures that moved through the ancient world like blood through a body. And the merchants who unloaded these goods traded more than commodities. They traded stories, myths, fragments of distant worlds. A sailor from Greece would speak of islands where the gods still walked. An Egyptian priest would whisper of rites performed in desert temples, of words that could open doors in the air itself, and in the taverns and marketplaces of Heracleon. These stories would blend and multiply, creating a kind of knowledge that belonged to no single people, no single truth. The city was magnificent. It had temples of red granite, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs and Greek letters intertwined, as if the languages themselves were learning to speak together. Statues of gods stood 30 feet tall, their stone faces gazing out over the harbor. Ammonius Gerib, the Egyptian lord of the sea, and Heracles, the Greek hero god, standing together as if they were brothers, as if the divine recognized no borders, only to share human need for something greater than ourselves. The streets were paved with limestone that gleamed white in the sun, so bright that sailors claimed they could see the city from miles away, shining like a star on the coast. At night, oil lamps burned in every window, and the reflection of those flames danced across the harbor water, doubling the light, making the city seem larger than it was, more radiant, more permanent. But nothing is permanent, not even stone, not even the earth beneath our feet. Sometime around the 8th century, though the date remains uncertain, blurred by the passage of time and the silence of sea, Heracleon began to sink. Not suddenly, not with the violence of earthquake or the fury of storm, but slowly, quietly, the way a dream dissolves when you try too hard to hold it, when you wake and reach for details that are already fading into the morning light. The ground beneath the city liquefied. Perhaps it was earthquakes, the Mediterranean floor shifting along fault lines invisible to human eyes. Perhaps it was the Nile itself, that ancient river whose delta has always been more fluid than land, more water than earth, constantly reshaping itself according to rhythms we can measure but never quite predict. Or perhaps it was both, and something else besides, some combination of geology and fate that we name with science but never fully understand. Buildings began to tilt, imperceptibly at first. A few degrees, then more. Cracks appeared in temple walls. Water seeped up through the limestone streets, pooling in the low places, turning roads into canals, then into shallow lakes. And the sea, patient as it has always been, began to claim what had never really belonged to land in the first place. Did the people know what was happening? Did they stand in their doorways and watch the water rising, understanding that their city was returning to the element from which all life first emerged? We cannot say. The historical record is silent. No ancient text describes the sinking of Heracleion. No poet mourned its loss. No historian recorded the moment when the last temple spire slipped beneath the waves. For 1,200 years, Heracleion existed only as a name in ancient writings, a reference in Herodotus, a mention in a tax document, a line in a religious text describing rituals performed at the Temple of Ammonius, a name without a place, a legend without proof. Scholars debated whether it had ever existed at all, or whether it was a confusion of other cities, a composite of memories, a story that had drifted away from its moorings in fact. Then, in the year 2000, a French archaeologist named Frank Gaudio was searching the waters off the coast of Egypt for shipwrecks, using sonar and magnetometers to map the seafloor. And the instruments began to show something impossible: the outline of a city, streets, buildings, harbor installations, lying 40 feet down in the murky green water of Abu Qir Bay. The divers descended through the columns of light, through schools of fish that scattered and reformed like thoughts, down to where the water grows colder and darker and the pressure begins to press against your temples like a question. And there it was, Heracleion, intact, statues still standing where they had been placed 2,000 years ago, inscriptions still legible, the carved letters filled with sand and silt but readable, naming kings and gods, recording dedications and decrees, stone anchors still tied to the ruins of docks, as if the ships they once held might return at any moment, temples with their walls still straight, their doorways still framing chambers that once held the sacred and now hold only water and silence. But here is the mystery that haunts everyone who has studied the ruins, everyone who has descended into that green twilight to walk streets that should not still exist. The city shows no signs of panic, no scattered belongings, as you would expect if people fled in terror, no broken pottery, no abandoned tools, no jewelry dropped in haste, no evidence of looting, no marks of fire, no sign that the city was attacked or that its people fought against their fate. The buildings stand calm and ordered, as if their inhabitants simply decided one day to leave, taking everything of value, closing doors behind them, walking away from a life they had known for generations. Or perhaps they stayed. Perhaps they understood something we do not, that the sinking was not a catastrophe, but a transformation, a return to an older way of being. Perhaps they saw the water rising and recognized it not as an enemy, but as a doorway, a passage into a realm where time moves differently, where the past is not past but suspended, waiting, preserved in the cold embrace of the sea. There are those who dive to Heracleion now and speak of a feeling they cannot quite name. Not fear, not sadness, but something else, a sense of presence, as if the city is not abandoned but merely sleeping, as if its people are still there, moving through their daily rituals in a dimension just slightly removed from our own, visible only in certain lights, audible only in particular silence that exists 40 feet below the surface of the world. The statues of the gods gaze upward through the water, their stone eyes fixed on a sky they can no longer see. Fish swim to the halls of temples, their scales catching what little light penetrates this far down, turning them into living jewels. Sacred creatures attending to altars that still wait for offerings. And the silence is absolute, not the silence of death, but of waiting, of breath held, of a question asked but not yet answered. Perhaps Heracleion was always meant to sink. Perhaps it was built as a threshold between land and sea, between the world of commerce and the world of myth, and its descent was part of its purpose all along. The Egyptians believed that the gods lived in both the heavens and the depths, that the underworld was not below the earth, but beneath the waters, that to sink was not to die, but to be transformed. The city rests on the seafloor, its limestone streets now pathways for currents, its temples now chambers where the only prayers are the wordless movements of water and light. Time passes differently here. Seasons mean nothing. Day and night are the same. Only the slow accumulation of silt marks the passage of years, centuries, millennia. And still the city waits, perfectly preserved in its liquid tomb, as if it knows something we have forgotten, that some places are not meant to endure on land, that some civilizations are destined to descend, to be swallowed by silence, to become mysteries that future generations will search for in the depths, finding not answers but only more questions, more wonder, more reasons to believe that the world is stranger and more sacred than we allow ourselves to remember. Perhaps it was never meant to be found. Perhaps the discovery is itself part of the pattern, the city revealing itself only when we are ready to understand that sinking is not always loss, that sometimes what we think of as endings are only transformations, only passages into a different kind of existence. The water holds it still, the sea keeps its secrets, and Heraclean waits in the green twilight, patient as stone, silent as depth, dreaming its drowned dreams beneath the surface of the world. The map that led into Shadow. There is a map drawn in 1513 by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis that shows a world that should not exist. It is kept now in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul behind glass, protected from light and touch in the slow erosion of air. The parchment is gazelle skin, stretched thin and marked with ink made from lampblack and minerals ground to powder. The lines are careful, precise, drawn by a hand that understood the weight of what was recording. And those lines trace coastlines that had not yet been discovered, describe rivers no European had sailed, name places that would not appear on official maps for another 100 years. Piri Reis was not an explorer himself, but compiler of knowledge, a gatherer of fragments. He claimed to have stitched his map together from more than 20 sources, some contemporary, some ancient, some so old their origins had been forgotten even when he found them. Portuguese charts stolen from captured ships, Greek maps preserved in private collections, and other sources, darker and more mysterious, that he mentioned only briefly, as if he were not entirely certain they should be spoken of at all. Maps, he said, that came from the Library of Alexandria before it burned. Charts drawn by sailors who had circumnavigated the earth in an age we have no record of, in a time before the known world had names. The map shows the Atlantic Ocean, the coast of Africa, rendered with remarkable accuracy, the eastern shore of South America, including details, bays, river mouths, island chains, that Portuguese explorers would not chart for another 30 years. And this alone would be strange enough. Evidence of knowledge that Piri Reis should not have possessed, sources he should not have been able to access. But the map's most unsettling feature is not what it shows of the known world. It is what it shows of the unknown. At the bottom of the map, where the parchment curves and the coastline bends southward into regions marked on contemporary maps as terra incognita, there is a landmass, mountains, rivers, a northern coastline drawn with the same precision as the rest of the map, showing bays and peninsulas, showing detail that suggests the mapmaker, or the original source Piri Reis copied from, had actually seen this place, had sailed along its shores, had recorded its features the way a traveler records what is real. This landmass is Antarctica. But here is the impossibility. The coastline Piri Reis drew is not the coastline of Antarctica, as it exists today, buried under ice 2 miles thick. It is the coastline as it would appear if the ice were gone. Mountains where mountains actually exist beneath the glaciers. Rivers where geological surveys have confirmed ancient riverbeds, now frozen, invisible, unknown to anyone in 1513. A northern edge that matches, with disturbing precision, the shape of the land that satellites and seismic imaging have revealed in our own time, hidden under an ice sheet that has covered it for millions of years. This should be impossible. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. It was not mapped until the 20th century. And the coastline beneath the ice, the actual shape of the continent, free from its frozen shroud, was not known until we developed technology sophisticated enough to see through miles of compacted snow and ice. No one in 1513 should have been able to draw this. No one in 1513 should have known it existed. And yet, there it is. Precise, detailed, inexplicable. Geologists who have studied the map confirm that the coastline matches what lies beneath the glaciers. Not perfectly. There are discrepancies, variations, but close enough that coincidence seems impossible. Close enough that the map appears to show Antarctica as it was in some distant past, before the ice came, before the continent drifted to the bottom of the world and froze into the white void we know today. But Antarctica has been frozen for at least 15 million years. There were no humans then, no civilization, no ships to sail its coasts, no cartographers to record its rivers and mountains. And even if we push the date forward, even if we imagine some unknown culture existing at the very edge of the last ice age, 12,000 years ago when the glaciers were retreating and the seas were rising, even then Antarctica was already frozen, already inhospitable, already hidden beneath ice. So how does the map exist? Pierre Reese himself offers an answer, though it is one that raises more questions than it resolves. He claimed that his sources included maps from the Library of Alexandria, that great repository of ancient knowledge that burned over centuries, taken with it uncounted texts, charts, and documents from civilizations whose names we have forgotten. He wrote that these maps were drawn by sailors who had circumnavigated the globe, who had charted coastlines and measured distances with an accuracy that should not have been possible in antiquity, who possessed knowledge of geography that would not be rediscovered until the age of European exploration. Skeptics dismiss this claim as fantasy. The Library of Alexandria, they argue, while undoubtedly vast, could not contain maps of Antarctica drawn before the Ice Age. There is no evidence of seafaring civilizations advanced enough to circumnavigate the Earth in prehistory. The similarities between Pierre Reese's map and the actual subglacial coastline of Antarctica are coincidence, or misinterpretation, or the result of Pierre Reese extrapolating from incomplete data and accidentally arriving at something close to the truth. But the map remains precise, inexplicable, a document that should not exist, drawn with knowledge that should not have been accessible, depicting a world that should not have been known. Some believe it is evidence of a lost civilization, a culture that existed before the last ice age, before the great floods that marked the boundary between prehistory and history, before the climate shifted and the glaciers advanced and the sea levels rose, drowning coastlines and erasing entire regions from the map of human memory. This civilization, the theory goes, mapped the world when Antarctica was still partially ice-free, when its northern coast was still accessible to ships, when it was not yet the frozen desert at the bottom of the earth, but a place where humans could have lived, explored, recorded. There are other maps that hint at this possibility. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531, which also shows Antarctica, also depicted with rivers and mountains. The Bwatch map of 1737, which shows a continent divided by a channel, a detail that modern surveys confirm. Beneath the ice, Antarctica is not one landmass but two, separated by a subglacial strait. How did these cartographers know? What sources were they using? But there's another interpretation, stranger and more unsettling. Some suggest that the map is not a record of the past at all, but something else, a memory of a future that once was, a world that branched away from ours at some pivotal moment, that took a different path through time, where different choices were made, different knowledge preserved, different catastrophes avoided, and somehow, through some mechanism we do not understand, a glitch in the fabric of time, a bleeding through of parallel histories, a trace of that world leaked into ours, a shadow on parchment, a map of a place that exists and does not exist, that was and was not, that remains as proof of something we cannot quite name. This interpretation feels like madness, and yet the map remains. And the coastline beneath the ice of Antarctica matches what Pierre Reese drew 500 years ago, what someone drew even longer ago than that, in an age we have no name for, using knowledge we cannot account for. Perhaps it was never meant to be understood. Perhaps a map is not an answer but a question, a challenge thrown across the centuries. What do you think you know about the past? What if the world is older and stranger than your histories allow? What if there were civilizations before yours, knowledge before yours, ships that sailed seas you believe were never sailed, cartographers who mapped continents you believe were never seen? The parchment is fragile now, the ink fading, the lines growing fainter with each passing year. One day, perhaps, the map will dissolve entirely, becoming one more thing we have lost, one more fragment of the past that returns to silence. But for now, it remains, behind glass, in the half-light of the museum. a map that leads into shadow, into the space between what we know and what we can prove, into the territory where history and myth blur together and become indistinguishable. And Antarctica waits beneath its ice, keeping its secrets, holding in its frozen silence the answer to a question we are only beginning to remember how to ask. Perhaps some truths are not meant to be discovered, only glimpsed, only felt as a shiver of recognition, a sense that we have been here before, that we knew this once and forgot, that the map was drawn not to show us where to go, but to remind us of where we've already been. The lines on the parchment fade, the ice remains, and the world turns, carrying its mysteries forward into a future that may one day become as lost and inexplicable as the past we are trying to understand. The stone that hums at dawn, in the vastness of the Jordanian desert, where the sand holds a memory of ancient caravans and the wind speaks in a language older than kingdoms, there stands a pillar of stone that should not exist. It rises 30 feet into the air, solitary and inexplicable, carved from the living rock by hands at work when writing was still young, when the first symbols were being scratched into clay and stone, when humanity was learning to make marks that would outlast the body, outlast memory itself. The Bedouins call it Al-Hajar al-Nik, the speaking stone, and they keep their distance. It stands where no structure should stand, far from any settlement, ancient or modern, far from water sources or trade routes, alone in a landscape of ochre and amber, of heat that shimmers and dissolves the horizon into something uncertain, something dreamlike. There is no temple around it, no foundation to suggest it was part of a larger complex. Just a pillar, tall and narrow, its surface covered in symbols that catch the light and shadow that seem to shift as the sun moves across the sky. The symbols are unlike anything in the known record of human writing. They resemble early Semitic script, the kind of marks made by cultures that lived 4,000 years ago, when Abraham was said to walk these same deserts, when cities like Ur and Babylon were still being imagined into existence. But the symbols do not form words, at least not words in any language scholars have been able to decipher. They spiral around a pillar in careful rows, each mark precisely placed, each line carved with intention, as if the stone itself were a scroll, a text meant to be read vertically, circularly, in patterns that follow rhythms we no longer recognize. Some archaeologists believe the symbols are musical notation, a score preserved in stone, meant to be sung rather than read. Others suggest they are astronomical, charting the movements of stars and planets across the night sky. Still others propose something more mysterious, that the symbols map the journey of the soul after death, that they describe passages through realms we cannot see, gates that open only for those who know the proper words, the proper songs. But it is not the symbols alone that make the stone sacred. It is the sound. At dawn, when the first light touches the pillar's eastern face, when the sun breaks free from the earth and sends its rays across the desert in shafts of gold and rose, the stone begins to hum. It is a low sound, barely audible, felt as much as heard, a vibration that moves through the ground, through the air, through the chest of anyone standing close enough to perceive it, like a voice singing in a language no one remembers, like a breath held for millennia and finally released, like the earth itself remembering something it has tried to forget. The sound lasts only a few minutes, only while the light strikes the stone at a specific angle, and then it fades, dissolving back into the silence of the desert, leaving behind only the wind and the emptiness and a question of what was heard. Archaeologists have studied the stone for decades. They have measured its dimensions, analyzed its composition, traced the tool marks left by whoever shaped it. The stone is sandstone, common to the region, porous and relatively soft, the kind of rock that wind and rain should have eroded smooth over the centuries. And yet, the symbols remain sharp, precise, as if they were carved yesterday, as if time has agreed to leave this one thing untouched. The tools used to shape the stone suggest Bronze Age craftsmanship. Copper chisels, perhaps, or harder stones used as hammers and scrapers. The level of skill required indicates a culture with advanced understanding of stonework, with patience and purpose, with something important enough to justify years of labor in the desert heat. Carving a pillar that serves no obvious function, that supports no roof, that marks no grave. But no one can explain the sound. Skeptics offer rational explanations. Wind moving through cracks in the stone, they say. Temperature differentials causing the rock to expand and contract, creating acoustic effects. Natural resonance is amplified by the pillar's shape and density. And these explanations are plausible, scientific, grounded in principles we understand, but they do not account for the consistency. The sound appears only at dawn, only when the light strikes at a specific angle, never at sunset, though the angle of the light is similar, never at midday, though the temperature differentials are more extreme, only in the first moments of morning, when the world is suspended between darkness and day, when the veil between seen and unseen grows thin. Researchers have brought instruments, have recorded the sound on digital equipment, have subjected the recordings to spectral analysis. The frequency is low, below the range of normal human hearing, perceived more as pressure than as tone. But within that frequency, there are patterns, regular intervals, rhythmic pulses, almost like speech, almost like song. Some scholars have attempted to correlate the patterns with the symbols carved on the stone to see if the humming follows the same rhythm as the inscriptions. The results are inconclusive, suggestive but not definitive, hinting at connections that remain just beyond the reach of proof. The Bedouins who live in the scattered camps nearby do not need proof. They have known about the stone for generations, have passed down stories about it from grandfather to grandson, from mother to daughter, stories that change in the telling but always carry the same warning. Do not approach the stone. Do not listen too closely to its song. They leave offerings at a distance, dates and water, small coins wrapped in cloth, sometimes flowers that will quickly in the desert heat. These offerings are not made to the stone itself, but to whatever the stone is speaking to, an appeasement, a request for continued silence, because the Bedouins believe or know, in a way that deep cultural memory knows things that cannot be proven, that the stone is not singing to us. It is singing to something beneath the earth, something that has been listening for a very long time, something that one day will answer. They teach their children to hear the hum from a distance, if they must hear it all, to acknowledge it with respect, but never to stand close, never place their hands on the stone's surface when it vibrates with that ancient frequency. Because to touch the stone while it sings, they say, is to become part of the song. And once you are part of the song, you belong not to the world above, but to whatever waits below. There are stories, whisper around campfires when the night grows deep and the stars multiply overhead. Stories of travelers who ignored the warnings, who approached the stone at dawn, who placed their palms against its surface to feel the vibration. Some returned changed, speaking in fragments, unable to describe what they had experienced. Others did not return at all. Their footprints could be traced to the stone and no further, as if they had stepped to the pillar itself, passing into some other space, some other time. These stories are dismissed by scholars as folklore, as cautionary tales meant to preserve the site from vandalism and theft. But the locals do not tell them as warnings alone. They tell them as history, as fact, as things that have happened and may happen again. The stone stands. The symbols remain unread. And every dawn, when the first light touches its surface, the humming begins again, patient, persistent, inexhaustible. A voice calling to something that is not yet answered, or perhaps is answered, in ways we cannot perceive, in frequencies beyond our hearing, in languages beyond our understanding. Perhaps the stone was placed there as a beacon, a signal sent into the earth, marking this location for something that would arrive later in another age when the time was right. Perhaps it is a seal, keeping closed a passage that should not be opened, singing its continuous song to maintain a boundary between what is and what should not be. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps it is only what the Bedouins say it is, a voice speaking to the depths, a prayer carved in stone, a message sent downward into the dark places of the earth, where something ancient and patient waits, listening, remembering, preparing for the day when the song finally stops and the silence that follows becomes an answer. The desert wind moves across the sand. The sun rises. The stone begins to hum. And beneath the surface of the world, in chambers we cannot map, in spaces we cannot imagine, something, perhaps, listens still, the tomb that faces the wrong star. In the Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs sleep in chambers carved deep into limestone cliffs, where walls are covered with prayers meant to guide the dead to the underworld, where gold and lapis lazuli still gleam in the darkness after 3,000 years, there is a tomb that does not belong. It was found by accident in 1947. hidden beneath rubble from a nearby excavation, so small that the archaeologists almost missed it, a doorway barely wider than a man's shoulders, cut into the valley floor at an angle that seemed wrong, that violated every principle of Egyptian funerary architecture. The tombs of the pharaohs face west, always west, toward the setting sun, toward the realm of Osiris where the dead must travel. But this tomb faces east, not just east, but toward a specific point on the horizon, a precise alignment, calculated with astronomical accuracy, pointing toward a place in the sky where a certain star rises, not every night, not every year, but once every 70 years, appearing briefly before dawn, and then vanishing again into the deep cycles of celestial time. The discoverers descended through the entrance, their oil lamps casting shadows that danced across bare walls. No inscriptions, no painted scenes of judgment and resurrection, no spells from the Book of the Dead to protect the occupant, to give them words of power, to teach them the names of the demons they would face in the afterlife. Just smooth stone, unmarked, silent, as if whoever built this place believed the dead needed no guidance, no protection, no prayers. The chamber itself is small, barely large enough for a single sarcophagus. And there it stood, not the gilded coffin of a king, not the painted wood of a noble, but a sarcophagus of black basalt, polished until its surface reflected like dark water, like the night sky without stars. The stone was seamless, fitted with such precision that no tool could find the edge where lid met base. It took the excavation team 3 days to open it, using levers and careful force, afraid of damaging what might lie within. When the lid finally moved, when it scraped aside with sound like thunder compressed into stone, they found the sarcophagus empty. No mummy, no linen wrapping stained with resin and time. No amulets, no scarabs, no grave goods of any kind. Just a single object, resting in the center of the basalt interior, a sphere of polished obsidian, perfectly round, smooth as glass, black as the space between stars. The sphere was removed, catalogued, studied with every instrument available to modern archaeology. It is approximately 15 centimeters in diameter, weighing just over 2 kilograms. The obsidian is volcanic glass, formed when lava cools so quickly that crystals cannot form, creating a substance harder than steel, sharper than any blade when fractured. But the sphere shows no fractures, no scratches, no tool marks. Its surface is so perfectly smooth that light does not scatter when it strikes, but reflects in strange ways, bending at angles that seem wrong, that make the sphere appear sometimes larger and sometimes smaller than it actually is, as if it exists slightly out of phase with the space around it. When you look into the sphere, you see only darkness. It absorbs light, drinks it, gives back nothing. Photographers who have tried to capture its image find that it appears in their pictures as a void, a hole in the photograph where the sphere should be, as if the camera cannot quite believe what it is seeing and refuses to record it. The tomb's alignment has been measured and remeasured by archaeoastronomers, specialists who study how ancient cultures used the stars to mark time, to orient their sacred structures, to connect the earth with the heavens. The entrance points to a specific declination, a precise angle above the horizon. Most scholars believe it targets Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky, sacred to the Egyptians as the embodiment of Isis, whose rising before dawn marked the beginning of the Nile's annual flood, the event that brought life to the desert, that made Egyptian civilization possible. But the alignment is not quite right for Sirius. The angle is off by several degrees, not enough to be accidental, but enough to suggest intention, to suggest that whoever built this tomb was aiming at something else. Some researchers propose a different target, a star that no longer exists. Stars die, especially the massive ones that burn bright and fast, consuming their fuel in mere millions of years before collapsing into supernovae, exploding across light years of space, leaving behind only neutron stars or black holes or nothing at all, just expanding shells of gas and the ghost of light still traveling through the void. If the tomb was built to face such a star, one that died long before the pyramids were raised, before the first dynasty, before Egypt itself existed, then what we see through the entrance is not the star itself, but its light, traveling for thousands or tens of thousands of years, arriving at Earth millennia after the source has gone dark. A message from something that no longer exists, visible for a brief window of time, and then lost forever as the expanding universe stretches the light beyond detection. This would explain the 70-year cycle, not the orbit of a living star, but the geometry of light traveling through space, visible from Earth only when our planet's position aligns with the trajectory of photons that left their source before human beings learned to speak, before we carved our first symbols into stone. But why build a tomb to face a dead star? What purpose could it serve? The Egyptians believed in eternal life, in the persistence of the soul beyond death, in the possibility of resurrection if the proper rituals were performed, if the body was preserved, if the name was remembered. But this tomb contains no body, no name, no prayers. It contains only an empty sarcophagus in a sphere that absorbs light, that reflects nothing, that exists like a wound in space, a place where something should be but is not. There is a superstition among the excavation teams who work in the Valley of the Kings, a belief passed down from the Egyptian workers who were present when the tomb was opened. They say the tomb was not built to house the dead, but to keep something out, that the sarcophagus is not a coffin but a container, and the sphere is not an artifact but a lock, holding closed a door we cannot see, a passage between this world and somewhere else. They say that on certain nights when the dead star's light passes through the tomb's entrance, when the alignment is perfect, you can hear something. Not a sound, exactly, but a pressure, a vibration felt in the bones and the teeth, like standing too close to bell the moment before it rings. And on those nights, the workers avoid the valley, refuse to enter the tombs, stay in their villages and burn incense, and recite prayers to gods both old and new, asking for protection from whatever the tomb is holding back. The sphere has been subjected to every test. X-rays pass through it and emerge distorted, showing patterns that make no sense, that suggest structures inside the solid obsidian that should not exist. Sonic imaging produces results that are impossible to interpret. Echoes that arrive before the sound is sent, reflections from surfaces that are not there. The sphere does not fracture under pressure. It does not melt under heat. It exists in defiance of what we know about matter, about physics, about the way the universe is supposed to work. And still it sits in its museum case, labeled and cataloged, a curiosity from an anomalous tomb, an object that no one quite knows what to do with, that most scholars prefer not to think about, that represents questions we do not yet have the framework to ask. The tomb remains open. Researchers can visit, can take measurements, can stand in that small chamber and look through the entrance toward the eastern horizon, toward the point in space where a star once burned and may burn no more. Few do. There is something about the place that discourages lingering, that makes even the most skeptical archaeologists feel watched, feel as though they are trespassing in a space that was never meant for the living. Perhaps the tomb is exactly what it appears to be, an anomaly, a deviation from standard practice, built by someone who had reasons we can no longer understand, who broke the rules of funerary architecture for purposes that died with them. Or perhaps the workers are right. Perhaps the tomb is a seal and the sphere is a lock, and the alignment with the dead star is part of a mechanism we're only beginning to glimpse, a way of keeping closed something that should never be opened, of marking a threshold between what is and what must not be allowed to be. The light from the dead star continues its journey, reaching Earth every 70 years, passing through the tomb's entrance, falling on the obsidian sphere that absorbs it. That gives nothing back. And whatever the sphere is locking away remains locked. For now, the darkness holds its breath. The stone keeps its secret. And the tomb faces the wrong star, waiting for the question we have not yet learned to ask.